Hello, my name is Abdul Faruqi, and I'm a former government investigations attorney with 16 years of experience handling complex cases at the local, state, and federal levels. Today, I wanted to talk about the Boeing criminal trial and the government investigations from an attorney's perspective. Um, Now, if you've been following the news, you've heard about the 737 MAX crash and the investigations that followed that. Previously, Boeing had entered into a plea deal, and the news is that the plea deal is not going forward. Boeing is withdrawing from it, and there's going to be a criminal trial scheduled for June 23rd of this year, which is not that far. It's only about 3 months away. So this is a critical moment in corporate accountability. Nowadays, I do personal injury cases involving a variety of plaintiffs and products liability cases, and corporate accountability is a main theme in the work that I do, and it was a main theme in the work I did as a prosecutor and government attorney. So here's a couple of things that I wanted to comment on based on my experience with these types of cases. Um, these cases don't come out of nowhere; they come out of significant facts. It's not very common for the government to hold corporations criminally responsible. There's been a number of times where, on a regular basis, companies will pay fines and civil penalties, but criminal enforcement is not that common. And in the case of the 737, we have the facts that 346 people lost their lives in two crashes of the 737 MAX aircraft in 2018 and 2019. The first crash occurred in October 2018 with Lion Air, and then the other one was in March of 2019 with Ethiopian Airlines. The first one, all 189 people on board were killed, and then just 5 months later, 157 more lives. And in recent news, we've been seeing a lot more aviation um, accidents and crashes, and this not related to the 737 MAX, but in aviation in general. This is an area that a lot of people are watching, and it'll be interesting to see how Boeing justifies the way that they develop their products and what they do, because they're probably going to take the approach that they did nothing wrong and that everything was right. And it's just a cost of doing business sometimes. But they won't say that, but essentially they'll imply that we were following industry standards and maybe we were even exceeding industry standards, and that these things just kind of happen. It's a complicated system. I remember dealing with, on the Medicaid side, involving massive government programs with complicated rules that people had to follow, and they didn't always follow those rules. When they didn't, they just said they would throw their hands up and say, hey, this is just too complicated for us to follow. The thing is, if you enter this type of business, if you enter this type of field, you know it's highly regulated. You know that it's mission critical, that everything must be done correctly. And oftentimes that conflicts with business interests. The business has an interest in making a profit, running things efficiently, and there is always going to be a trade-off. And that is the reality that we all don't want to accept, that there's going to be a trade-off. And the question is, as a society, do we want companies to make more profit, or do we want things to be safer, or can we have both? Usually we can have both, but it might take a little bit more time to get there. And sometimes people are not patient, and sometimes people are unethical. And I think that's part of what leads to the criminal aspect of this case. So these were originally characterized as accidents, but investigations revealed that Boeing had deceived the FAA in describing their critical automated flight control system called the MCAS, the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. And this basically, the 737 MAX, if you know about the plane, you've probably flown in one. It was originally described as a football, like it was a small stubby plane. It was low to the ground. It had a limited amount of capacity, and over the years they've just made the plane longer and longer. The engines, one of the issues with the plane was that the engines were pretty small and the plane was low to the ground. So as engines get more efficient, they tend to get bigger, and so the air intake became bigger. But if they put it in the same place, it would scrape the ground. There would not be enough clearance, so they had to move the position of the engine. That changes the weight distribution of the plane. And to compensate for the tilt or the weight distribution, they created the software to do that. But um, it really changes at some point. The plane changes so much that it doesn't keep the same type rating. Like, these planes like Boeing 737-100 series through the 900 next generation series, and then these MAX planes. Ideally, you train a pilot on one kind of plane, and then once you train him on one plane, you don't have to train them for any other type of plane. Basically, it's like, if you get the 737 and you have the 100 series or the 500 series or the 1000 series or whatever have you, it's the same plane. And so that's what they're really trying to do here, is they're trying to improve an existing plane and suggest that it was just the same as a previous model, that you could just give a pilot an iPad and they'd understand how the system works. But they were not fully forthright with it. And in these criminal investigations, when they make these kind of representations to authorities, there are a lot of things that they share. And what happens in criminal cases is, it's typically an issue of materiality. Was the representation they made, was it material? Was it critical to the authorities' decision to grant the license or grant permission, airworthiness certificate, or whatever it was that the oversight authorities do? Or was it just kind of like, this is just one more thing, it's not critical, it's not important? That's going to be probably a focus of this case, is that they made a material misrepresentation of some kind. That's probably going to be something litigated. I don't specifically know all the facts of this case in terms of how they have charged it and what is the linchpin, but in a lot of these cases, because there are so many facts, because the cases are so complicated, there will be an attempt by both sides to try to distill the case into some simple principles. And that's what a lot of what trial lawyers do. We take complicated fact patterns, things that can be very confusing, we try to simplify it. The prosecution especially is going to have to try to simplify it, because they carry the burden of proof. Even though it's a company, even though it's an air crash, they still have to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. So let's talk about that side of the case. Let's talk about the path to criminal charges. In January 2021, Boeing entered into a Deferred Prosecution Agreement with the Department of Justice. What this means, you typically will have, you might have an indictment. People have heard of someone getting arrested, and then there's an indictment, and then you go to court. Well, sometimes you can have an agreement where prior to charges being brought, there's a Deferred Prosecution Agreement. For example, really like a pretrial in state court, that there might be like some kind of pretrial agreement that we're not going to bring charges in the event that you enter into this contract and you do certain things. And that contract might be like paying a fine and doing restitution, doing some community service, whatever it might be for an individual. For a company, they do those same types of things. And sometimes they enter into these agreements even after the case has been filed. But all of this requires clearance at the highest levels. For a case like this would be handled with higher-ups at the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. And because this happened in 2021, because it happened, a lot of the activities here occurred in a prior administration. These types of things are going to be influenced by the people who were there at that time. So, the company agreed to pay $2.5 billion in penalties, which seems like a lot of money, but, they were going to pay a criminal fine of $243.6 million, so $2.5 billion in penalties, $243 million in fines. That's about 2.7 million, more than $2.7 billion in fines and penalties, and that's significant. And then 2 years later, the DOJ found that they had violated this agreement. So they had a contract that this is what's going to happen, so you avoid prosecution. They violated this agreement, and it seems like when the door plug blew out of an Alaska Airlines 737 MAX, it seems like that was the catalyst. I'm not exactly sure all the terms of the agreement, but the agreement requires probably a certain degree of corporate monitoring and oversight and reporting of incidents, and it seems like that was a catalyst for the government to come back and look at it again. In July 2024, Boeing agreed to a plea deal to resolve those charges, and that was last year. And it looks like the district judge, Reed O'Connor, rejected this plea agreement in December 2024. And the rejection of that plea agreement, which was shortly after the election of President Trump, he rejected on the basis that Boeing and DOJ had a diversity, equity, and inclusion provision, and the court didn't like it because it seemed like, and my recollection is that it required using DEI factors to appoint somebody who would be doing the compliance for, on behalf of the government monitoring Boeing. And that's a significant responsibility, and it's something that you want somebody who is representative of American society in that type of position. And sometimes these people that do this oversight may be chummy with the executives at Boeing. So that provision seemed to divest the court of the authority to appoint one. And that sometimes happens just in general in court. There's going to be certain types of settlements that may occur, and taking this out of like the corporate context, but maybe the day-to-day stuff that I see in smaller cases, like a personal injury case, might be like the appointment of a guardian ad litem to look out for the minor's best interest. Now, the parties typically, they can either agree on who is going to be the person that's going to look out for a minor's interest in a case where a child was injured and we're trying to figure out if the settlement makes sense for the child. Courts typically appoint it, but sometimes the party can agree to it. And I don't recall exactly what it was that the judge had a concern about, but for me, I think that kind of provision could have easily been amended, but it looked like there were probably some underlying issues there with Judge O'Connor's interpretation of the DEI provision. He took issue with the language in the plea agreement regarding the selection of the independent monitor. The provision had a statement regarding DOJ's commitment to diversity and inclusion in selecting the monitor. And in his ruling, and I have this part, the judge wrote, the plea agreement requires the parties to consider race when hiring the independent monitor, and in this case of this magnitude is the utmost interest of justice. The public is confident his monitor selection is done based solely on competency. And this focus on DEI aligns with the broader conservative judicial attempts to scrutinize diversity initiatives. Judge O'Connor, who was a George Bush appointee with a long history of favoring conservative causes, was known for decisions that challenge Democratic administration policies. So again, this judge was a Republican appointee, was conservative. I don't know what DOJ was necessarily thinking with putting that into the plea deal. It seemed to, I don't know if it was intended as a poison pill or not, but it certainly had the effect of causing the judge to have concerns about this deal. So that was one concern, and that seemed to be a little bit more on the culture wars that happen outside of the courtroom, and sometimes they come into the courtroom on this basis. I think DOJ would have selected somebody who was competent. And I think once you get to your choices of who is competent, then from there you start thinking about, who do we put in place that the public is going to feel confident that, this person, again, as I referenced earlier, is not like the best friend with the Boeing's executive team or something like that. So, race could be a factor in DI concerns. Economic background could be a factor. But, the selection of a monitor that, one person that represents the people, I don't know about that type of term. I've never seen it myself in cases, and I think it's admirable for the advancement of bringing people into these types, opening doors and helping people advance. But it's unfortunate that that provision created a basis to reject, which seemed like an otherwise reasonable plea deal. The court also had a concern about how it will limit the court's oversight role, and it prohibits imposing a condition of probation, a requirement for Boeing to comply with the monitor's anti-fraud recommendations. So basically, the judge felt, and I think this is probably more meritorious, that the plea deal bypassed the judicial oversight by making the corporate monitor an internal matter between DOJ and Boeing without sufficient court involvement. And I can see why the judge might be offended by that because, ultimately, if there is a violation of terms of an agreement, then, they would come to the court and seek a resolution from the court seeking, you violated the terms of your probation or the terms of, in a criminal context, if you go on probation, you're going to be told by the court, you got to do your community service, for example, you got to pay a fine. And if you don't do it, even though you've made the agreement with the prosecution, the court has signed off on it, the court's going to impose a penalty. So in this case, probably because of the complexity of the issues at hand that needed to be monitored, they didn't want to keep coming back to court because sometimes judges take months to schedule stuff. Sometimes they need time to review things, and it's a little bit more quicker and efficient to resolve some of these smaller issues just between the parties. And many judges don't want to deal with the administrative headache of this, but given this case was so big, I think the judge had an interest in overseeing this. But when they draft these things, they don't always know what the judge is going to do. They have smart lawyers at Boeing, smart lawyers at DOJ, and I believe they probably were caught surprised by some of the things that the judge was doing in regards to this ruling. And it could have been probably the changing political climate that made the judge want to have, I can't really opine on what judges are thinking. I don't know Judge O'Connor, but it's possible that the judge wanted a larger role in a case that had national interest. So, Judge O'Connor was on the federal bench back in 2007. He's a member of the Federal Society, which is a conservative organization. He ruled that in 2018, he ruled that Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, was unconstitutional. He blocked the Obama administration protecting transgender students. He halted protections for same-sex couples under the Family Medical Leave Act. He struck down a rule barring healthcare providers from discriminating based on gender identity. So there's a number of rulings here that are consistent with like a more conservative approach. So again, even if DOJ has good lawyers, and I don't know why before this judge they went forward with the DI provision. Maybe DOJ doesn't care that the plea deal goes south, and maybe they do want to try it, and maybe that's why they created this type of agreement, just so that they would have an excuse to go to court, knowing that it would be unpalatable for the judge. That again is a possibility. And my experience with these types of things is that the public and what's reported in the news is only a fraction of what actually happens behind these closed doors. O'Connor has been a judge for conservative litigants. This is a great jurisdiction for conservative issues, and I'm curious to know how Boeing's going to fare at this trial. One of the things that happens in the media, and especially when you're doing analysis, is you're looking at something and trying to decide if it is good or bad. I think this trial could be better for the victims, whether that was the intention or not. The families of the crash victims have been, from the news reports, have been criticizing the plea agreement as a sweetheart deal. They feel like Boeing's not being adequately held accountable. Like $2.5 billion in penalties is a lot of money, but given how much money it takes to actually undermine these companies and to actually get them to seriously, treat it as a like existential crisis issue for the company. Like the fine equals, the profits for the next 5 years or 10 years or whatever it might be. Um, if they're able to do that, then yeah, that's a significant extraction, and they might be able to get that at trial versus a plea deal where companies are never going to pay the full value of their exposure. Um, having settled these types of cases with investigations with the Attorney General's office on the civil side, I know that potential exposure in these cases can easily be 10 to 20 times the fine that they pay. So, if it was like a $2.5 billion fine, their penalty exposure was potentially 25 billion. And so getting 10% of that is like a big win for Boeing, but it also looks like a lot of money for the public. And that's part of these settlements, is that when you start talking about billions, it seems like a lot of money. Um, so, some of them, I believe the media has reported, they view it as an important victory. And I mean, given that this is a criminal case, and the company is paying the fine, there's not going to be any individual that's going to go to jail. I recall not too long ago that a Boeing engineer was tried as an individual for a criminal case in federal court, and he was acquitted. So that's the only instance I can think of related to this Boeing case where there was an individual held accountable. But a public trial would benefit the victims. It would expose Boeing's wrongdoing. There would be potentially harsher penalties from what's in the plea deal, and it would be a more public. It would be a more public revelation of the investigation. I mean, a lot of these investigations and these findings were shared with the public about why the crash occurred, right? But a lot of, especially criminal investigations, a lot of the information is not publicly revealed because it's protected by things like various criminal investigative privileges where, if somebody made a Freedom of Information Act request, they would not get that. The news media would not get that. Sometimes the news media gets this information from talking to confidential sources. Sometimes criminal investigators will reveal information, but oftentimes not everything is revealed, especially if there's a pending criminal case, because it may prejudice the jury pool. It'll be very interesting to find out who could sit on this jury that hasn't heard about the Boeing case, and who can claim that they can make a fair decision. I mean, most people, Boeing and Airbus, they are essentially a duopoly. There's some planes out there like Embraer and I'm trying to think, some smaller aircraft manufacturers for these regional jets that are not Boeing or Airbus, but a lot of people that have flown in a plane, that have flown a long distance, it's going to be a Boeing or Airbus plane. And they're all going to have thoughts and opinions. Everybody's heard about the 737 MAX, so picking a jury will be interesting. But in the course of the trial, they're going to find out more about the full extent of what Boeing did. There's going to be, presumably, especially in a criminal investigation, I imagine there's going to be some coordination from the FBI. Maybe they will be talking. Maybe there might be some OIG inspectors. A lot of these government agencies have an Office of Inspector General, and they have a criminal unit, and they do specific criminal investigations, not just into their own agency, but also related to that agency. So, for example, like in the Medicare system, if there's healthcare fraud by a provider, Medicare has OIG agents who are not only investigating how money is being used. Well, they're investigating how money is being used by the Medicare program, but if someone is defrauding it by, a doctor submitting a false bill, something like that, they have criminal investigative authority. These are people who carry guns and they do investigations, and I imagine several of the government agencies involved with Boeing, they probably have details and information. Those investigators might be called as witnesses, but there's probably going to be a lot of experts as well that are going to testify, and you're probably going to hear stuff that you've never heard before in the media up to this point that was privileged or prevented from being shared, that only a criminal case can share. I also anticipate that, Boeing executives, individuals will be named. You're going to hear the names of witnesses and all the people there. And I think if the DOJ is successful in getting a conviction in this case, that I believe the judge is going to have a lot more leeway without that plea agreement in place to do sentencing, because in federal courts there is no jury that assesses punishment, and in state court there is. Juries will decide the punishment phase of a criminal trial, at least in Texas. They do that, but and you have the option of going to the judge, of course, and I believe they do that in California as well on the criminal side. But in federal court, sentencing is determined by the judge. And no matter what happens in this case, if Boeing is convicted, they most likely will appeal it, and then they'll appeal it all the way to the Supreme Court. But my estimation is that given it is a conservative judge who is hearing this case, and given that the Supreme Court is conservative and a number of levels along the way are conservative, if there's a conviction, it most likely will stick. And the question is, will there be a conviction or not? There's a lot of exposure here. There's not going to be a plea deal at this point, from what I understand. And I don't think Boeing's going to pursue one, given this one was rejected. But, the company, aside from this, the company is not doing that great financially. Aside from the, $2.5 billion criminal conviction and penalty that they could have gotten done with the plea deal, they have had $33 billion in core operating losses since 2019. So like in the last 6 years, they have been losing $33 billion. So that's a significant sum of money. That's about $5 billion in losses per year, roughly. They have a debt of about $53 billion. They recently had a strike that cost them $1 billion per month. So a $2.5 billion fine is just $2 billion, and it's about 2 months of losses. It's not that significant, and that's why I think the victims' families are probably right that maybe a $20 billion fine and penalty might be a little bit more sensible, given literally hundreds of people died from these aircraft. They're going to continue, regardless of what happens, they're going to continue facing a negative cash flow in 2025. Boeing has already taken the reputational hit in the public for their aircraft, and I think that is part of the calculations that occurred here with taking a plea deal, is to resolve some things so it doesn't stretch out. But at this point, they may have reached the point where we don't have much more of a reputation to save, so we're going to go ahead and fight this. And they have expressed that they want to make safety and compliance and public relations like a priority. So it's going to be interesting that on the one hand, they're going to end up having to try this case, and they will try it, maybe hopefully appealing to the administration to give them some kind of leniency or some kind of back channel support through the way the case is prosecuted. We're in unprecedented times. I remember working in the government where a lot of things, the civil servants were very isolated from political decisions. So you had political appointees. When I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office, I worked under a Republican appointed U.S. attorney and a Democratically appointed U.S. attorney. And both of them, while they had their priorities in terms of what they were asked to do, one of them was tasked with getting the border wall, laying out the legal support to get the border wall put up. And then another one was tasked with specific criminal investigations and concerns about protecting public safety locally and taking on cases that maybe were not being handled as well by local governments. Each of them had particular priorities, but the day-to-day things that prosecutors would do, it followed a pretty formulaic approach. And I think a lot of people are having concerns that there is not going to be that type of thing happening, because in this case, a criminal defendant like Boeing may go straight to the President of the United States and ask for special consideration, and that may flow through to people who are trying this case. I find that that's going to be very difficult to put into practice in a way that's tangible. Meaning, unless the president comes out and says, "Don't prosecute Boeing," or this is, like what he said with the January 6th protesters, where he's explicitly pardoning people who are involved and potentially going after former employees that didn't align with the president's views on things. I just don't see that happening with Boeing. I think nobody really likes Boeing. I think Boeing may try their chance at trying to influence to the extent they can, but I just don't see that being a major concern. I think already the FAA has imposed more oversight on Boeing. There's a production cap on the number of planes they can make. There's already on-site inspections. There's already an action plan in place that's not going to change because of this deal. They still have these requirements. There's different levels of regulatory enforcement. There's as I was saying, there's different levels of enforcement. There's going to be, your administrative, regulatory side. There's going to be the civil penalties. There's going to be the criminal penalties. And I think, sometimes when I do these videos, I get a call or something and I have to stop it. But what I was basically saying is that there's different layers of regulatory oversight here. And even if the criminal case is delayed, there's still going to be some kind of administrative process that's ongoing involving the FAA. But typically, civil penalties track criminal, so even if the criminal case, whatever happens with it, there's still probably going to be a follow-up civil case. If the criminal case resolves a lot of the things that the civil case wants, it's going to be a global resolution. Otherwise, there may be two different things happening in the criminal case and the civil case. And it's possible that Boeing beats one, but they might not beat the other one. But what's notable, what's popular nowadays is to talk about the current administration and how they are undermining the rule of law and how people may be taking advantage of that. In the current political landscape, this Deferred Prosecution Agreement was finalized in the final days of the Trump administration, so the first Trump administration in January 2021. And now Trump has returned to office. There's questions about, how they may approach this case. And, there's mixed signals here. The Transportation Secretary, Sean Duffy, says regulators must be tougher on Boeing. But that's the Transportation Secretary. That's different from the Department of Justice. And, different cabinet members may be saying certain things, but it doesn't really mean that's going to necessarily translate into court directly. President Trump has maintained close ties with Boeing. As president, he negotiated with Boeing on the Air Force One. I think you guys might remember that he negotiated the cost of the Air Force One plane and said that he saved some money. And that happened directly after the second 737 MAX crash, showing willingness to engage with the company. So I think there's opportunities here. I don't think Boeing is necessarily in a position to take as much advantage of this withdrawn plea deal as they might hope, or shareholders must not read into it. I'm not going to predict the stock market, but I wouldn't be so confident that Boeing going into this trial is in a good position. That's what I'll say. I was kind of curious about how the way President Trump is perceived by the public and maybe people who know him and know how he handles things, how his public persona and what he does in private is it's the topic of a lot of documentaries. And recently there was a movie, The Apprentice, that talked about President Trump's relationship with then attorney Roy Cohn. And he was an attorney. That was one of Trump's closest legal advisors back in the day. And You hear in that movie, and I know it's just a movie, but the three principles he talks about in that movie are always attack, never admit wrongdoing, and always claim victory after defeat. I have seen that type of aggressive posture taken by corporate defendants where, they once they get into litigation posture, they're on the defensive, but they will be on the offensive, meaning they will paper the file, make a lot of requests, not so much focus on the substance of the wrongdoing, but the procedures used. And so the Department of Justice is going to have challenges because no prosecution is perfect. There's always going to be a potential procedural hiccup somewhere. It really depends on the judge how much leniency they're going to give for whatever hiccups they might be, whether it's late turned over discovery or something incomplete, or maybe an agent or someone in the case doing something that can be interpreted as being wrong or improper. That's where a lot of the attacks may be, because I think substantively the government wouldn't be bringing a case, normally shouldn't be bringing a case if it's just a battle of experts, if there's a difference of opinion. I think generally people are going to see, I think, based on what we're hearing in the reports, that Boeing knew they were wrong and they covered it up. And I think that is probably going to be the story that comes out in trial. I think it'll be interesting how much this prior plea deal is going to be considered. And it shouldn't be considered as an admission of guilt, especially if it's withdrawn and it goes to trial. But it'll be interesting to see how the government basically will establish the fact that they are liable. And it's possible that Boeing will make that admission in court that they are guilty of it. But the purpose of the trial may still be that because the court does not accept their plea, there still may need to be a finding from the jury that they are guilty, and then the court gets free rein to assess their own punishment and how they see that fit. And so, I think people are thinking that Boeing is trying to escape responsibility, but that's going to be very difficult to do, I think, unless it's a complete total denial, which would be preposterous from a public perspective, given the public knows what's going on. And I just don't see how you come across as a credible company denying responsibility at the same time trying to publicly tell people to trust you. I think what's going to probably end up happening in this trial is an admission, but it's just that, while before they traded their admission of guilt in exchange for an agreement that had some leniency in it, now they're going to make an admission of guilt knowing that it's going to be entirely up to the judge. And so their focus may be explaining what would be a more fair deal for them. I don't think they're going to get a fairer deal than what they got before. It may be tweaked a little bit, but I still think they're going to pay a substantial fine and a substantial penalty, and they're ultimately still going to get convicted. So that's kind of my take on what I think is going to happen. I think if it proceeds to trial on June 23rd, I think there's going to be at least a dozen DOJ attorneys, even if they're not directly in court. I would expect, in a case of this magnitude, at least 8 to 12 attorneys. There's going to be lots of agents working on this case, a lot of technical people involved. I think Boeing's going to have at least double that. That's been my experience. There's going to be 20 plus attorneys probably on this team. You're not going to see all of them in court. Lots of technical and consultants, lots of expert witnesses. Given the complexity of this case, I don't see this case being tried in less than 2 months. It could be 2-3 months, even possibly longer. It could be one of these things that basically takes the whole summer to finish. And I think there's going to be tons of documents, especially internal communication showing Boeing knew about the MCAS or MCAS issues. There's going to be a lot of discussion about certification documents and what Boeing said when they certified. Like, typically when you apply and send things to the government, you have to make affirmations and swear to things. There's going to be a lot of close scrutiny about particular representations made in that document that were not true and any ambiguities there. the training materials provided to the airlines, the testimonies from the engineers who raised these concerns. Some of those people will be testifying. Some of the things that that DOJ did in their trial against that one Boeing engineer, I think they're going to bring that back up in this case as well. And, I imagine what will happen is that there probably will be a conviction. I think there will be a sentencing that will be, 6 months or more after. There might be some interlocutory appeals, attempts made to challenge different things. There's going to be some motion practice. But ultimately, I think we're going to hear family members in a year or two probably testify about the impact that this has had. I think there's going to be a ruling from the court. And either it's going to be roughly the same deal they get or potentially could be worse. But because of the current political landscape, it could be that 1 or 2 years from now that even with that conviction, depending on what happens, there could be a reduction of some kind coming from the executive. But I just don't see Boeing escaping criminal liability in this case, and if they do, I'd be very surprised. So appreciate you spending your time with me. Thank you for watching, and I'll be watching this case and continue to provide updates as it develops.